No one knows exactly when it began. Some say it was when Ibrahim Traoré quietly stepped down from a dusty helicopter in Ouagadougou, clutching the unsigned declaration. Others say it began in silence, when 3 national seals touched. And the first lines of ink wrote a new destiny, the Federal Bank for Investment and Development, CBID. But everyone knows that day, Africa stopped asking for permission. 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, stood upright in the fiery sands of the Sahel and said, "We no longer borrow the future. We print it ourselves." From that moment on, history was no longer written by others. If you believe that freedom begins with your own hands, please like, comment, and subscribe, because this is the story of the generation that is rewriting the map of the world. On September 15, 2025, there was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no foreign delegation, no applause from the plutocrats. Only 3 capitals, Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, resounded with a quiet but resounding announcement: we give birth to the Federal Bank for Investment and Development CBID. With an initial capital of $833 million, not from Paris, Washington, or Brussels, but from the very veins of the Sahel, CBID was considered the biggest financial shock since the 3 countries left ECOWAS and the CFA currency system. No one called it a bank. They called it a fortress of money. And from there, a resounding question: can freedom be minted in forgotten francs? They were used to the clanking of money that did not belong to them. For decades, the CFA franc, printed in Paris, has been a symbol of dependency framed in clean bills, with a face that is not that of the Sahel. The people of Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger live, work, sweat on their land, but its value is measured by the will of others. Ibrahim Traoré once said at a closed meeting in Ouagadougou, "We are used to asking for money to build a house. But we are never allowed to choose the direction of the windows. Enough is enough." That sentence, which seemed like a lament, became the first signal of an uprising. The story of Africa, from the 20th century to the present, is written not only in blood, but also in debt. Development loans, humanitarian aid packages, economic stabilization policies, all have the same shape: a signature rope. A Malian journalist wrote, "We are never free, because every morning when we wake up, the money in our pockets has been priced in Paris the night before. When you have to ask permission to spend your own money, you are no longer a nation, you are just a branch of an empire." The 3 countries of the Sahel know this better than anyone. They are frontiers where the world sees only sandstorms, terrorism and poverty. But hidden under the red dust is something bubbling, the will to be called in their own language. When CBID was born, no one dared to believe it was real. A bank not subject to IMF supervision. An institution that does not report to France. A fund that does not need a guarantee from the West. Everyone thought it was a joke. But when the declaration was signed, when the first intra-block flows of money flowed through a payment system independent of the euro, people realized the joke was over. CBID is more than a bank, it is a symbol of self-respect. A self-respect that was once crushed by contracts, advisors, and hidden strings attached to every loan. Now, people who were taught that economics is a subject of the strong have written their own new textbooks. In the CBID meeting room, there are no expensive suits. Some are in military uniforms, some in old brown shirts, some from fishing villages on the Niger River. They do not talk about ROI or FDI flows. They talk about electricity, water, seeds, and a road connecting 3 capitals without crossing borders. It was there that Ibrahim Traoré uttered a sentence that went down in history. "If we do not finance our dreams ourselves, others will sell them to us for double the price." And from that day on, the concept of banking in the Sahel took on a new meaning. It was not just a place to deposit money, it was a place to store dignity. Imagine a small regional bank, without Western backing, openly challenging the old monetary system. It was predicted to collapse in 6 months. But 6 months passed, and instead of collapsing, CBID grew strongly. Because unlike international financial institutions that always demand conditions, CBID invests directly in solar power systems, intra-block railway infrastructure, and agricultural cooperatives. Not to make a profit, but to create autonomy, a word that Africa has lost for too long. The railway lines connecting Bamako, Niamey, Ouagadougou gradually take shape. Solar farms spring up in the middle of arid regions. And most importantly, trust begins to return. Trust that they do not need Paris to light their homes. Trust that money can be an instrument of liberation, not a shackle of dependence. The initial silence of Western powers did not last long. As soon as CBID announced the first transaction using a non-CFA payment system, a series of commentaries appeared in the European media. A strategic mistake. A reckless move. A step back into populism. But perhaps they forget that, in history, every liberation began with an act of madness. From Nkrumah's Ghana to Sekou Touré's Guinea to Sankara's Burkina Faso, people were once called dreamers. And then it was those people, with their will and self-respect, who rewrote the chapters of history that the world had to reread with respect. In the early days, when CBID opened its first doors, long lines of people lined up, not to withdraw money, but to deposit it. A woman in Gao told a reporter, "I put it here not to get interest. I put it to see my faith kept in a place where no one dictates it." The image spread on social media. A bank with no advertising, no big signs, no slogans, just a sentence engraved in iron on the wall. Our money. Our rights. Our future. From then on, the concept of economic independence was no longer a slogan at conferences. It became a reality every time the people of the Sahel held in their hands the new banknotes, printed with deserts, rivers, and their own faces. No one knew how the world would react when three small countries dared to build their own financial fortress. But those involved knew they had crossed the line of fear. They had lived through coups, aid cuts, and the threat of sanctions. But this time, what they were building was not a government, but an institutionalized trust. A trust that circulates, invests, and grows, without the approval of any empire. In the hot corridors of Ouagadougou, a young economist said, his voice trembling with emotion, "We have become accustomed to living by fear. Now it is time to live by faith." The world was silent, but the silence was as thick as the night before a storm. International financial institutions began to monitor. Western investors withdrew. European media reported rising regional risks. But in each small office of CBID, people continued to work, each number, each signature, each project. They did not need praise. They only needed time and faith. Because they understood, no revolution blossoms in the spotlight. It only grows in silence, where each drop of sweat seeps into the soil. Each coin changes hands, and each heart believes, freedom is real. In the distance, the sun sets over the Sahel desert, dyeing the sand and sky red. A child looks at his father putting the new banknote in his hand and asks, "Daddy, is this ours?" The father smiles. "Yes. And from now on, you won't need anyone's permission to spend it." And in that moment, CBID is no longer a bank. It is a declaration of a nation. When the first news about CBID appeared in the international media, people laughed. "The three poorest countries in the world are creating a bank," they said. But when the numbers started to move, when 500 billion CFA francs were converted into $833 million, and when the first projects were announced, the laughter died down. Paris held an emergency meeting. Brussels reacted. Washington was silent. But in that silence a storm was brewing. Le Monde writes, "A symbolic but dangerous challenge, because it could rekindle the illusion of sovereignty in other countries." They call sovereignty an illusion. But for the Sahel, it is the only belief they have left. For decades, the CFA franc has been the economic tether of 14 African countries to the Banque de France. France controls 50% of their foreign exchange reserves, sets the value of their currencies, and, more importantly, determines their monetary policy. The birth of the CBID was the first umbilical cord cutting in post-colonial Africa. No one believed they would dare to do it. But they did it, and did it in silence. When the seals of three countries touched, not only was a new financial system born, but the old world order began to crack. An anonymous French official admitted on television, "If the CBID succeeds, the entire CFA bloc will collapse. And with it, our influence in West Africa will disappear. But some things cannot be prevented, just as the sun cannot be hidden forever." In Bamako, a rally broke out in front of the new CBID headquarters. Thousands of people carried banners reading, "Our money, our rights." Traditional melodies mixed with drums. Chants and songs echoed throughout the square. A farmer stood in the middle of the crowd and told a reporter, "They used to call us beggars. Today, we call ourselves investors." The phrase spread like wildfire on social media. No one spoke of aid anymore. People spoke of self-investment, two words that had never existed in the Sahel's political vocabulary before. But the old world never left quietly. As the CBID expanded, international financial institutions began to issue warnings about public debt risks, lack of transparency, lack of supervision. European banks froze the three countries' reserve accounts in their Paris branches. Western experts appeared on television, speaking in a low, arrogant tone. They don't understand how modern economics works. This is just politics, there is no financial basis. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré responded with a single, steely sentence. We don't need a financial basis. We need a dignity basis. CBID launched 12 strategic projects: railways, solar power, an interregional payment network, agricultural cooperatives, and a regional airline connecting the three capitals. What astonished the world was not the scale, but the speed and the funding. There were no international investment funds, no aid. There were only interregional savings, state capital, and community funds. Each project sprang up like the pieces of a dream forged in sweat, not debt. A child in Niamey, seeing electric lights for the first time in his village, asks his mother, "Who turned on the lights for us?" Her mother replies, her eyes filling with tears, "We." International analysts call CBID a risky experiment. But in Africa, it has another name, the awakening. They know the risks, they know that sanctions could come, that trade could be strangled, that the media would smear them. But they go ahead. Because sometimes, survival is not the goal, it is honor. In a rare speech in Ouagadougou, in front of tens of thousands of people, Ibrahim Traoré did not give a speech. He simply said, "We were taught that freedom is a luxury. But look around, it's in your pocket. It's the new banknote, printed by the Sahel. It's a pledge that we will not return to the past." At that moment, the crowd fell silent. No slogans, no shouts, just tears in the burning sun. Freedom, it turns out, can be as small as a banknote, but as heavy as a pledge. With the new payment system, goods and services began to flow between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger without going through European intermediaries. Border markets, once deserted by currency controls, were now bustling. People no longer used euros, but the regional currency, guaranteed by CBID. A young trader in Kushiala said, "Before, we lost 10% when transferring money to Burkina Faso. Now, we just scan a QR code." Technology, once considered a luxury, has become a weapon of equality. The global media cannot ignore it. The Economist wrote, "The Sahel is creating the first post-colonial economic model, where sovereignty is not a slogan, but an operating mechanism." In Addis Ababa, African Union representatives discussed replicating the CBID model. Nigeria, Ghana, and Guinea have begun sending delegations to learn. Even in South America, some countries are considering similar union banks. From a small idea, CBID has become a spark that has spread across the ocean. That night, Ouagadougou was ablaze. Not because of electric lights, but because of the flames in the hands of thousands of people gathered around the square. They lit candles, not to celebrate victory, but to remember the past. An old man whispered. "In the past, they said we couldn't manage our own money. Now they're scared because we did." There were no speeches, no fireworks, just silence and faith. Because sometimes, silence is the highest form of affirmation. If you believe that the freedom of the Sahel is not just the story of three countries, but the echo of all humanity, share your thoughts in the comments. Let the world see that when a people dares to stand up, not only do they change, but history bows before them. In the past, the Sahel feared the West. Now, the West itself is beginning to fear the Sahel, fear a land that is poor but does not submit, weak but does not beg, small but dares to challenge the global financial system. A French analyst wrote bitterly, "We have underestimated the poor. They do not need much, they only need faith. And that is the most dangerous thing in the world." 3 national flags, red from Burkina Faso, blue from Mali, yellow from Niger, flutter above the CBID headquarters. The Sahel wind blows, carrying sand, blood, and oaths. A young employee standing below, eyes looking up, says, "I studied finance to leave Africa. Now I study to stay." No one knows where CBID's future will lead. But everyone knows, it has sown the seeds of faith, something that can survive even in the desert. And as the sun set, it was said that the Sahel sky that day was not just red with sand, but with the pride of those who no longer trembled. January 2026. Just 4 months after the CBID was established. A report from Brussels spread across the news agencies. The European Union officially suspended all aid activities and froze the assets of 3 Sahel countries. Sanctions followed one after another: oil, electronic components, banking equipment, even the accounting software that CBID was using. The West wanted to strangle the currency fortress as soon as it was formed. Reuters commented, "This is a way to force them back to the old order, before the dream of sovereignty spread." But in the Sahel, people no longer dream. They wake up. Neighboring African countries, which had welcomed the birth of CBID, are now silent. Some governments fear being dragged into the crisis, others are pressured by France and the United States. Nigeria refuses to trade crude oil. Ghana suspends electricity cooperation. Senegal temporarily closes its borders, citing regional financial security. In the Ouagadougou Parliament Hall, lawmakers argue. Should we back down? Traoré simply replies, "If we have to pay for freedom, we should pay with suffering, not with submission." A black market has emerged with counterfeit currency, so sophisticated that even bank scanners have trouble detecting it. Goods are scarce. Inflation is soaring. People are starting to panic. Have we made a mistake? One night, the national television station is hacked, broadcasting a fake clip announcing the dissolution of the CBID. In 20 minutes, the Sahel is in chaos. But soon after, the official channel went on air. CBID is still standing. Our enemies are not outside our borders, they are in the minds of those who have stopped believing. The phrase became a slogan: trust, not punish. In the midst of the crisis, Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré suddenly went missing for 72 hours. Rumors spread quickly: coup, assassination, betrayal. Western news agencies reported in unison. Reports indicate internal conflicts in the Sahel bloc are escalating. But on the 3rd day, he appeared on television. Thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, standing in the shadows of the CBID headquarters. He said, "I was not arrested. I am here, among those who are starving but refuse to bow their heads. If one day I fall, remember, we are not fighting to win, but to prove that we dare." That speech was broadcast across Africa. A Dakar journalist wrote, "From Mandela to Sankara, no one has ever spoken of freedom with such a hoarse voice. No need for external enemies, a system collapses fastest when its own people begin to doubt it." A group of senior financial advisors at CBID, trained in France, were caught secretly passing transaction data to a European brokerage firm. When arrested, one simply said, "We just want the system to be stable. You can't build a bank on trust and pride." Traoré looked at them straight in the eye. "No, but you can build a nation on it." The traitors were brought to public trial, not to punish, but to prove that trust can be judged. The embargo began to tighten, medicine was scarce, fuel was down, food tripled in price. On the streets of Niamey, long lines of people waited for rice. Some people were angry and threw stones at the bank headquarters. The CBID still tried to hold on, opening an interblock civilian salary payment program. Exchanging food for labor. Projects were suspended, leaving only the energy and clean water sectors. In desperation, a teacher in Gao wrote on the blackboard for her students, "We do not study to survive. We study to be worthy of those who suffer for us." The photo, which went viral online, became a symbol of hope in the dark. In Brussels, an internal report leaked out. The embargo may be counterproductive. Repression is only strengthening the independent spirit of the Sahel. In closed-door meetings, European diplomats began to split. One side calls for tougher sanctions. The other warns that things are getting out of hand. A German scholar writes, "We are witnessing the birth of a new African identity, shaped not by aid, but by being pushed to the wall." In mid-March 2026, CBID announced the success of the Sahel 1 solar project, providing electricity to 300,000 households, entirely funded by the bloc. When the first lights came on in the outskirts of Niamey, people cried. Not because of the light, but because of the proof that the bloc was still alive. A child asked his father, "Daddy, they said we couldn't do it, didn't they?" The father replied, his voice trembling, "Yes. And that's why we have to do it." From Niamey, the light spread to Bamako, then Ouagadougou, like blood flowing back through history. 5 months into the crisis, Western newspapers had to change their tune. Financial Times wrote, "Despite the blockade, CBID has maintained internal liquidity and has not defaulted. An unprecedented financial feat." Meanwhile, in Africa, people began to talk about the Sahel Doctrine: economic autonomy, internal transparency, social trust. Young activists in Kenya, Sudan, Congo hung up the slogan, "One day, we will have our own bank." CBID is no longer an organization, it has become a metaphor for self-determination. In May 2026, in a terrorist attack on an official convoy near the Niger border, Ibrahim Traoré is seriously injured. He is flown to Ouagadougou in critical condition. The news spread throughout the Sahel. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets to pray. 3 days later, he died. No state funeral, no official statement, just a line on the gate of the CBID headquarters. He fell, but the bank is still open. A statue of him was erected from scrap metal. Standing in the middle of the square, holding the first Sahel banknote. No tombstone. Because, as a child says, the dead are buried, but the awake remain. After Traoré's death, leadership was transferred to the Three-Nation Council. No one had the same prestige as him, but he had taught everyone not to bow down. They announced the plan, CBID, Phase 2, expansion to Chad, Guinea and Togo. Despite fierce opposition, the plan was approved. A Western journalist asked a council member, "Aren't you afraid?" He replied, "We are not afraid of sanctions. We are only afraid of losing trust, something that has been paid for in blood. The world is noisy. CBID chooses silence. No announcements, no press conferences, no slogans. They work and wait." In 2027, when much of the global financial system is shaken by the debt crisis, CBID is still standing. Not by a technical feat, but by a single principle: only lend when the borrower is willing to stand with, not below. 3 years after its founding, a boy in Gao was asked, "Do you know what CBID is?" He replied, "It is where adults keep their promises." No one is left to discuss whether CBID has succeeded. Because success, in the history of the Sahel, is not about being rich, but about not returning to captivity. An African scholar writes, CBID is not just the first bank of the Sahel, it is the first chapter of Africa's second declaration of independence. And perhaps, when history is rewritten, there will be a small line at the foot of the page. In 2025, the poorest taught the world the value of freedom. In the desert night, the Sahel wind still blows, carrying the echoes of the generations that have fallen, and of those who are rising. They no longer speak of debt, of interest rates, or of credit ratings. They speak of dignity, of will, and of a flame that has never been extinguished. From the 3 countries considered the weakest, the Sahel has written a new chapter for the whole of Africa, not with weapons, but with faith in the value of free people. And perhaps, in the silence of the numbers, we hear a message from Traoré. If anyone asks how much freedom costs, answer, with the blood of those who have not sold it. Today, CBID is no longer a bank. It is a symbol. The heartbeat of an awakening continent. Proof that sovereignty is not a concept, it is an action. If this story touches your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel to spread the fire of Sahel together. Because history is never written by the silent. And now it is our turn, together, to keep the fire burning.